Mostly, nowadays I mostly focus on jujitsu. We do teach, the self-defense aspects of jujitsu in our academy. So like, I want my students to learn at least the basics of striking. Like there's nothing worse to me than like, a blue belt that can't throw a punch, like, or doesn't have the understanding of a punch or the understanding or the biomechanics of a kick. Doesn't mean I want you to be like a pro fighter. I don't even need you to be even great at it. I want you to be good enough, though, that if you came across some fool out there in the real world that's throwing some crazy ass punches and kicks, you could handle that. Not like you've never even experienced a punch or seen a punch or don't even understand the mechanics of it. Like, how can you understand how to like defend that if you can't like do it yourself? At least understand the basics of it, right? So I require my students to at least get the basics up to blue belt. I want them to know the self-defense, like, basically the combatives of self-defense of, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And I want them to know at least the basics of striking. I came up doing that stuff. I've been doing martial arts my whole life, since I was a kid. I started when I was, 10, 11 years old, 51. I've been doing it my whole life. Like most people back then, I started out doing Taekwondo because it was like the only thing. This is like, early 80s. Martial arts wasn't really that popular yet. It was in like 84 when Karate Kid came out that it like really kind of blew up, became more like a kids thing. When I first started doing karate back then, there weren't even like kids in the class. Like the school that I went to, the Taekwondo school, there were adults and kids together, but there was only like a couple kids. There was a few kids that really wanted to do it. And then there was a bunch of men and a few ladies, and that was pretty much it. And it was very different back then. There wasn't like the sparring gear like nowadays. We didn't wear rib protectors and head protectors and stuff like that. We probably should have, but kind of like a lot of things back then, right? I don't remember ever wearing a seatbelt when I was a kid or wearing a bike helmet. Doesn't mean it was smart, right? It's just how it was those days. But I did Taekwondo, and I think like when I did Taekwondo, I saw the limitations of it too. Like I remember thinking like, I don't really understand how to box. And I was always the kind of martial artist that I wanted to be a martial artist. I wanted to be good at everything. I wanted to sort of develop my own kind of eclectic martial art for myself. Like I knew that Taekwondo was good at kicking. It was a focus on kicking, but then there was a point where like I need to learn how to box. So I went to a boxing gym and I started learning how to box. And then I ended up doing Kempo karate. This is like the early 90s. The school that I trained at was mostly like a kickboxing school. Like we didn't really do forms and stuff like that. It was mostly just like 16-ounce gloves and like pounding the shit out of each other. And I did that for a while. And that kind of, I still saw the limitations of the striking. And this was like probably right before the UFC, like maybe 1991. And I knew that I needed to like learn some kind of ground fighting. I didn't know really what it was, but I knew that like I needed to know how to grapple and grab onto people. And I ended up going to a ninjutsu school. When ninjutsu, ninjas, right? When ninjutsu came to the US, like in the 70s, there were basically two practitioners that trained under Hatsumi in Japan. One of them was Stephen K. Hayes, which most people know about, wrote a lot of books. I remember getting his books when I was a kid. And then there was another guy, Robert Bussey. Now, Robert Bussey was more like a kind of like hardcore combatives, like guns and like, like really like hardcore stuff. It didn't have that kind of spiritual side to it like Stephen K. Hayes had. He was more like, Bussey was more like combatives and like grabbing people's hair and smashing their face and like a lot of weapons and stuff. So the guy that I trained under, like lived with him for a while and trained with him. And the school that I trained in was more like, we grappled a lot. We weren't doing like throwing stars and a lot of weapons and stuff like that. We were more like kind of grappling. We had mats, we were doing locks and submissions, but it was a very raw version of it. It definitely wasn't like jiu-jitsu, but it was like at that time, the closest thing to it, we were grappling and locking up. So to me, it felt like, the next stage of my training. And at that point, we really didn't know about jiu-jitsu in the US. It wasn't really into 93 until Royce Gracie, entered the UFC 1 actually, which happened out here in Colorado, that everybody started to see it. Like if you were a martial artist at that time, the UFC was kind of like, holy crap, man, these guys are nuts, dude. They're like fighting. We thought people were going to die doing that. So, I did ninjutsu, and then eventually that like around 95, 96 started leading into jiu-jitsu.